Shalom, shalom. This evening, I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about idolatry and service of other gods and how Torah and more broadly Tanakh understand these activities. And in particular, I think there's a set of practical implications I eventually hope to get to, where this really is about how we're meant to understand our present moment, like particularly when thinking about politics in Israeli society, because I think that there's some pertinent points. But I think before getting into those details, it's good to just kind of zoom out a little bit and think in terms of the more theoretical question of what are the different sources that we can use to try to make a bit of a map of how the Torah and how our Nevi'im have taught us to understand, and how Chazal have taught us to understand what the different, maybe separate kinds of issues or temptations are in, let's say, serving other gods or bowing to idols. And we're not going to do like all of Masechet Avodah Zarah or something. This is not like all the halacha that may pertain to idol worship or something like that. I'm trying to ask more general questions. I think the way I would pose the challenge at the outset is that I think there are maybe two different kinds of axes, at least, along which we sometimes kind of blur an important distinction and just lump it all in together into one thing and say, oh, there's this idea of, and then we have some word for it, avodah zarah or idolatry or whatever it is, like the sort of the serving other gods thing that you're not supposed to do. And it's all kind of one activity, and it breaks down into different kinds of reasons people do it or things they hope to get out of it, or what kinds of actual actions they're taking or things they're engaged in. But I want to make a few separations that I think might be healthy to study in different sources. So one is, I think, a basic point is just to ask about a person when they're serving some god in the conception of Tanakh. We're looking at a person, whether it be, let's say, at the outset, someone who's serving Hashem or someone who's serving a false god, or and doing so with some amount of sincerity or not. But let's say that they're doing one or the other. What are they hoping to get out of it exactly? Why are they doing it? And really, I think this is more a question that pertains to serving a false god, because it kind of it's really about the relationship that one has with an idol or with a false god. But I think one thing that you could say is a reason someone would do this is because it's a transaction. Like when we talk about paganism from the perspective of the Hebrew prophets and try to point out sort of the problem, the critique, it's that this is something that you're doing because you're trying to buy an outcome that you want. You're trying, in a sense, to say this idol somehow summarizes something about the powers that be in the world, and I'm trying to get those powers to act on my behalf to get a result that I want. So there's the aspect of idolatry or avodah zarah or whatever you want to call it that we could say is you're trying to make it your magic, and you want it to be a vending machine. You want it to be the thing that does for you what you need it to do. But there's also the aspect of it of you are trying to decide what a worthy goal to have is, right? Another reason that people have gods that they serve, so to speak, is because even if they were very powerful, very capable of achieving goals that they could set for themselves, they crave guidance in how to determine what goals to set, right? And this kind of partly depends just on how well off you are, right? If you're sort of hanging on by your fingernails at the limits of survival, then yeah, mostly you're probably concerned with just what's going to get me food or shelter or these basic needs. But the more you start to have your basic needs met, and you're talking about a society where people have some choices to make with how they spend their time and energy, then there's this other question that arises, which is, well, even if I can do certain things to produce certain results that I might aim to accomplish, why should I do A instead of B? What is a way of setting my efforts and my goals such that afterwards, when I accomplish them, I'll feel like I have served some value. And in a strange way, that this kind of almost by definition makes it so that it's about something that isn't just transactional, right? Because the idea with the transaction is you already know what you want and you're trying to purchase it. But then the idea with a value is that, in a sense, you are trying to decide what to purchase, and you find satisfaction in being guided or being told or being taught what it is worth trying to acquire or accomplish. And so in some ways it sounds like more noble, right? Because in one case you're trying to get something definite and you already have this kind of material or whatever kind of goal set. And the other case, you're trying to devote yourself to something else. But obviously you can devote yourself to the wrong thing, right? So there were idols that people devoted themselves to, again, in a way that might have not been self-serving in a narrow sense, but they were still devoting themselves to some false god of some sort, and it's still idolatry. So that's one kind of axis I think we want to be aware of, because sometimes I think we kind of blur the distinction and stop thinking about it, that there's the aspect of avodah zarah or idolatry that's about, I want to buy for myself in some way, using them, cooking the meal for the god that the god likes, so the god will lend his power to me and give me what I want. There's that kind of transaction. But then there's also well, I don't really know what I should want. Can you please tell me? And I will feel satisfied by having done the will of a power greater than myself that I somehow have chosen to honor and respect and give myself over to, because ultimately I would otherwise be tortured by my own uncertainty about whether the goals I was setting were the worthy ones, right? Both of those are impulses in human nature. And again, one of them is maybe harder to have when you're barely able to survive, but when you're talking about a situation where a person has a certain amount of freedom of action and a certain amount of choice to play with, then both of these things come into play. That's one kind of axis. There's another kind of axis, which I think is maybe a simpler one, but it's worth fleshing out, which is that sometimes we use the word idolatry in English, and it refers in general to just serving false gods, but really we should make distinction also between bowing to actual statues or images, or sort of worshiping and adoring actual images, which is a thing that is forbidden in the Torah and is more generally considered a problem in the sort of ideology of the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew prophets and all of that. And then also the idea of serving other gods, right? Because I think that sometimes we may kind of blur again that distinction and say, well, if you're not really face down on the floor in front of a stone graven image, then you're not really doing the thing that's a problem, according to the Torah, and everything else is just kind of too abstract and let's not talk about it. But really, I don't want to argue this from the text. It seems that the Torah understands that it's not just that really idols like graven images, stone statues or whatever per se are the problem only, but really that there's this idea of serving other gods or paying tribute to them, or even kind of, let's say, just using them to make a map of your world. And you don't necessarily need to actually be looking at pictures of them or bowing down in front of statues of them in order for that to be the case. So I also just want to kind of talk in terms of, okay, there's the relating to false gods through their actual cultic ritual practices with their images, their stone idols or whatever. And then there's the, maybe this is an axis, maybe this is a broader category of things, but there's also just the notion of what it means to serve another god. And I don't think that's the same thing per se as prostrating yourself before a stone image. So that's like just two different kinds of things to lay out in abstract terms. And now I just want to jump into a few different sources, hopefully in fairly rapid fire, in order to try to map this out for ourselves a bit in terms laid out in Tanakh, so that we can understand how these issues are understood a little bit. So maybe the best passage in Tanakh that's very elaborately directed at this question, this first question about what is an idol for, on one end of that axis, is this passage in Yeshayahu, Perek Mem Dalet, where the Navi is trying to, in a sense, kind of make fun of or critique the behavior of someone who is worshiping a graven image, right? And so, it's a lengthy passage. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's about an idolater who makes an idol out of some wood that he got, and the way that the Navi kind of points out the risibility or the ridiculousness of this behavior is, he says, "Etzav saraf b'mo esh al etzav besar yochel yitzle tzali v'yisba af yahom yomar he'ah hamoti ra'iti u." He burns half of it in the fire. With this half of it, he eats meat. He roasts the roast and is satisfied. Yes, he warms himself and says, "Aha, I'm warm. I've seen the fire." ושאריתו לאל עשה לפסלו, הסגד לו, וישתחוו ויתפלל אליו, ויאמר הצילני כי אלי אתה. And with what is left of it, he makes a god, his carved image. He falls down to it and worships it and prays to it and says, "Save me, for you're my God." So this is I think, we could complicate the question of what Hatzileni means. Maybe you could say that the Navi is leaving it a bit ambiguous which version of serving a false god this really pertains to, but I think the emphasis here maybe is more on getting your God to do what you want, right? Like, this is someone who's very practical. He's making a fire for himself out of some of the wood because he wants to eat. And then this is just kind of an extension of that. Like, I use some of the wood to make a fire. I roast my food with that. I eat the food. And then I also use some of the wood to make an idol. And then I prostrate myself before it and say, "Save me," because I still have other problems besides the fact that I was hungry. And I want some kind of magic on my side. So I'm going to, ask this graven image I'm going to use the fact that I can make a carving that somehow connects me to a power. And I hope that the magic works, or I hope that this practice somehow connects me to an activity that will have practical implications for me that help me. And we've talked before about how I don't think that one should give so little credit to ancient idolaters in the sense of saying, "Oh, they were idiots because they believed in magic. The magic doesn't actually work. And so they thought that their little, magical idols were helping them, and they weren't really, and they were fools." Because I think when we add up all of the practices embedded in the sacrificial cult of some idol and all the different kinds of shared conventions and all the different kinds of activities that involve transmission of information, or activities that to some degree have practical implications, it's not necessarily the case that an idol does nothing for you, right? Like, we can both have the notion that the magic doesn't work. And it could also be the case, for example, that you have, I don't know, some false god of agricultural fertility, which includes in its cultic practices, I don't know, burying fish heads where you're planting crops or something, which means you're fertilizing the field. And so there's a sense in which something that we can, even with modern science, kind of look at it, we could say, oh, maybe there's some practical benefit to the ritual in that part. But then the part where someone's, additionally kind of dancing around a stone statue and bowing in front of it, that's not doing anything. That's not going to make the ground more fertile. But burying the fish heads part, that worked. So there are things maybe that, when you sum up everything that some ancient idolatry of a false idol amounted to in the activities, by people that it brought about, there may have been a lot of things that were real about the power that the idol granted, at least to a society, if not to an individual, because of the collective behavior that it guided, right? So we don't want to say like, oh, this is foolish, because there's no sense in which it works. But nonetheless, when Yeshayahu is looking at this kind of narrowly described situation where someone kind of carves a graven image of their God and then bows down to something they just carved with their own hands and asks it to save them, it looks kind of silly. And also, it's very focused on the what's problematic about the idea of being saved by something that's really the work of your own hands, as opposed to being saved by that which is truly greater than you and truly not just a means in your own hands to try to gratify yourself, right? So that's a first passage where we kind of can triangulate from plotting these different points in the whole space that we were trying to say we wanted to map out. And I'm not sure that I'm 100% certain there is a source that seems to go to the opposite extreme, but I would say at least if you look at the golden calf, this iconically, or let's say archetypally important moment pertaining to idolatry in the Torah, and how the Torah basically introduces us to the idea of worshiping idols in the context of Bnei Israel through this episode with the golden calf, where Aaron, the Kohen, is asked by the people to make some kind of god, and the language that they use, they say, so it's Vayomer, well, so this is Aaron repeating it, but the wording is the same. I go up to the earlier. Well, I think the wording of this part will be the same anyway. So this is Aaron recounting the story. He says, "Vayomer li," they said to me, "Aseh lanu Elohim asher yelchu lefaninu." Make for us, and it's the grammar is plural, so it's make for us gods asher yelchu lefaninu, that will go before us. And that, I think, does contain a bit more of this idea of a God that is not just a means for you to solve your problems, but maybe also you want guidance. You want to know where you should be headed, what you're trying to do. Now, the people are in the desert here, and so guidance right now serves both purposes. So I think it's hard to pry things completely apart and fully disambiguate and say, oh, well, this is just a form of idolatry where it's all just about, I want a value because I'm searching for meaning and I have everything I need, but I'm just trying to decide how to use my power and what I'm searching for a point to what I'm doing. That is, in the advanced society of the modern era that we live in today, that sounds like a more familiar notion, because I think people feel very well supported by all the technology and all of the sort of wealth and stability that they live in the midst of. And then it's more kind of typical that you would maybe find someone saying, I'm searching for the raison d'etre, like why should I be? What am I trying to do? Maybe it's not so easy, in fact, to fully pry that away from the more practical question of like, how do I get what I want? Because maybe you choose what you like as an idea, what you should be trying to do, partly because, in fact, it appeals to your other notions of what you might want. So that's complicated. But I think at least this idea of gods that go before you, asher yelchu lefanenu, this is, in a sense, about this idea of, I want to be told what to do. I don't just want food. Like, I want food, so no one needs to tell me I want food. I want it, so let me roast in the fire, and also I have other needs like that, so let me bow to my idol so that it will save me, so to speak. It's also about what should I be doing? Where should I go? And I want some power that I can follow, right? And I think the point there is just that we do see in Tanakh or in the Torah both kinds of ideas. The idea of maybe trying to use the power of some god to accomplish a task that you decided is important, versus one that maybe is about more sort of giving you direction so that you know what it is that you should be trying for. And I think you also see that in other elements. So, for example, Paro, the god king of Mitzrayim, is maybe in some sense the best example of how both of these things merge, because at various points over the course of the Torah, we both have the idea in Egyptian society that Paro is the one who feeds everyone, right? There's going to be a famine, and Yosef is very smart, and he helps Paro figure out how to buy low and sell high and make sure that there's always kind of food for everyone provided by the state. And so at that level, Paro is owed all of this allegiance because the people don't want uncertainty in food supply, and Paro levels out that uncertainty, and so they owe their fealty to him. And so the system is set up so that they're slaves to this god king because they're getting something out of the bargain that they want. And the text is explicit about that. Like the people of Mitzrayim they sell themselves to Paro in this episode with Yosef, precisely on that basis. But they also, in Mitzrayim have rules that don't seem to be directly about that. And they seem to be more about rules that somehow show values, right? Like there's this repeated theme that somehow slaughtering sheep is a problem or hanging out with shepherds is a problem. And it's a to'eva, it's a abomination of the Egyptian society to eat with shepherds. Or Moshe is worried that if the people slaughter sheep or lambs in the presence of the Egyptians, that they're going to stone Bnei Israel for doing that. So it may be that you could argue somehow that there are practical implications to that operate downstream, but I think at the outset you have to say that has a bit more of a ritual quality, a bit more of a value kind of quality, and maybe it's a very foreign or peculiar value, like I'm a really good person because I never hang out with shepherds. It's like a hard thing to relate to, maybe again in this day and age, but for a Mitzri in that time, I don't think that it would be as much directly a rationale of, I don't eat with shepherds because I get what I want from this ideological system. Like I'm hungry or I want clothes on my back or shelter for my family. And the gods will give me that if I refuse to eat with shepherds, and I see how that works. It's more like it's a part of a value system where the gods are starting to also tell you, here's what it means to be virtuous, and here's what it means to, defy the mores or the conventions of the society. And that helps you to feel like, when you have stayed in bounds or when you've gone out of bounds, and you derive satisfaction from the idea of properly conforming and participating without necessarily always thinking of every aspect of that as being a direct transaction where you're sort of purchasing food that you want for yourself. And obviously these things just roll together eventually, because when Paro, so to speak, is teaching his people about his whole ideological system, you don't sort of itemize the different things that you're doing and saying, these are the things that are ritually functional and give you a sense of value and meaning, and these are the things that are going to get you food. You just say, obey Paro, and here are his gods, and here's how you find out everything you should be doing. And one of the things that you should do, which is a virtue, is always do what Paro says, including working yourself to death in the fields, and also maybe some other things to do with shepherds or other things the priests need that are more ritual, what have you. And maybe there's some appealing values in that people get out of it as well. So I think the point is that we get both things, right? In avodah zarah and idolatry and serving other gods, there's both kinds of things, and very, very often they're blended together in ways that it's not so easy to distinguish. And we'll talk in a bit about Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel. And I'll just mention, like, before getting into detail there, where I want to make a different point, that is also an example where there's a bit of blurring of that distinction, because you have these people building a tower, and on the one hand, it's a piece of technology, and a very tall tower could be used for lots of things. It could be a fortress to, look for enemies who are coming from far away. It could be a way of surveilling your own society to make sure that people behave better because they feel like they're being watched. It could be, on the other hand, that somehow it's supposed to be inspiring, right? To have a society that believes in technological achievement and v'rosho b'shamayim, that its head should be in the heavens, that maybe they're actually trying to use what they have to put together with their limited means to achieve something that's somehow transcendent, that reaches the heavens, that gains some kind of perspective on what's right and wrong, that has a kind of divine quality. So we'll get back to that, but I think that is again a distinction that's not necessarily so easy to make in that example and say which side it falls on. But I think defining those two poles on the axis, like the transaction versus the virtue or value, helps us to see both of those aspects in what people seek when they choose to serve a god. And now the other thing I just wanted to say about what you actually are doing when you're serving gods is that it seems like we also learn from the Torah that there are different kinds of things that consists of, and they're not the same activities. So on the one hand, there's the thing that maybe is the most obvious, and we maybe tend sometimes to focus on that, and that's just like if we go to Aseret HaDibrot, the quote-unquote 10 Commandments, Lo yihye lecha Elohim acherim al panai. So you shouldn't have any gods before me. And it immediately goes on, Lo ta'aseh lecha fesel v'chol tmuna asher b'shamayim mima'al v'asher ba'aretz mitachat v'asher b'mayim mitachat la'aretz. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for you any engraved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Lo tishtahaweh lahem v'lo ta'avdim ki anochi Adonai Elohecha el kana poked avon avot al banim al shlishim ve'al rebeim lisonai. You shall not bow down yourself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting iniquity upon the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. Okay, so that's the statement in Aseret HaDibrot. But the distinction I want to make here is that it begins with Lo yihye lecha Elohim acherim al panai. The general statement is don't have other gods. Okay, but then it's sort of being miforash a bit. It's trying to lay out what does it mean to have other gods. And the first example it presents seemingly is Lo ta'aseh lecha fesel v'chol tmuna asher b'shamayim. Like don't make a picture, don't make a graven image, and then it elaborates Lo tishtahaweh lahem, don't bow down to them. But then v'lo ta'avdim, and don't serve them. Now, you always, when the Torah gives a list of things, you can maybe create some confusion about whether it's listing things in order to kind of give context for the same statement and saying, okay, what does it mean to bow down to something? That is what it means to serve something. And so they're the same thing. Or you could say, well, no, these are two different things in principle, or at least not fully 100% identified. So yes, there's bowing down to a picture or a graven image, or bowing down to some god in some way. But then there's also serving that god. And there might be a lot of different things that serve that god. A lot of different kinds of activities that you might be engaged in. And I think when we see this fleshed out, once it's in Masechet Avodah Zarah, once it's with our sages, and even really based on other psukim in the Torah, it starts to be more clear, I would say, that we're not talking about a situation where it's only about bowing down to statues. I think you might say that Chazal creates an ambiguity about this still. But so there's another pasuk in the Torah, elsewhere in Sefer Shemot, Uvechol asher amarti alechem tishameru v'shem Elohim aherim lo tazkiru lo yishama al picha. So don't remember other gods, and let not their names sorry, not their names, but lo taskiru lo yishama al picha. Sorry, so the pasuk, the way it puts it is B'Shem Elohim achirim lo taskiru lo yishama al picha. So don't mention or remember the names of other gods. And that is not the same thing as bowing down to a statue. So I believe on that pasuk, the example that Chazal give when talking about improper speech with respect to the names of other gods would be, even if you were saying to someone, because you're living among goyim who have idols, let's say, so there's a statue of some god who is, standing over there, and you just want to meet your friend, in the town square, so to speak. So you say, "Oh, I'll meet you on the south side of the statue of God X," right? So that would be an improper behavior because you are using the name of that God for a purpose that helps you, right? So you're not even swearing some oath by him or calling upon him to intervene and help you or anything like that. You're not bowing down to the statue. And there is a statue in the picture in this example that comes from Chazal. So it is a little bit ambiguous whether this is the same kind of issue if there's no statue involved. But I think what it's showing is how even if you're just using the statue as a landmark and letting it be part of the geography of the world that you inhabit and that you're describing, you're doing something wrong, because the use of the term, the use of the words on your lips, is kind of making you more powerful. And again, even in an incidental way, where you're not trying to sort of dive deep into the mythology of that deity or the cult of worship or whatever, you're just saying, "Oh, I'll meet you on the other side of that statue," but you're using the name of the god, and therefore you're benefiting from the existence of the idol. So I think in these different sources, the main thing I just want to point out and flesh out a bit is that, yes, there's a specific problem with making graven images like statues and bowing down to them, but that's not the only kind of problematic behavior that you could put in the class of serving other gods and engaging in what maybe, if we're using a big tent for the term, engaging in like what we use the word in English, idolatry. Idolatry, maybe for the rest of this talk, let's say, I'm not going to just use the term idolatry to mean you carved an image out of stone or wood or whatever, or you looked at the heavens or whatever, and you picked something that you could see and then you bowed down to it. It also could be just that in your behavior and in your speech, you have oriented your value system, you have set your goals, you have developed your criteria for deciding about how to act and stated it as such in certain terms, and that might constitute serving other gods. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be the case that it's the sort of straight down the line, look, this person is prostrated, nose down in front of a stone statue of deity. It could be something subtler than that. It has more to do with speech. That has more to do with the way you make a map of the world that's going to help you decide how to act in it. That could become an issue, and we have to be careful with that, obviously, because we now have to also ask the question: well, what is the difference between correct and incorrect usage of something to accomplish a means, as a means to accomplish an end that you have, in the world that you inhabit, if you are trying to have the proper relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because you could say, well, if it's the case, for example, that you're flying in a plane and chas v'chalila, the plane engine cuts out and people need to jump out of the plane with parachutes. So is using the parachute Are you suddenly in an idolatrous relationship to the parachute? Are you saying to the parachute, you are a deity and save me? Or are you saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, save me? And then you jump out of the plane and pull a ripcord and the parachute opens. And you're able to say, Hashem is the one who saved you, but there was a means in the world that obviously was, a kind of technology that you had to employ or make use of in order to choose your route to salvation that you were trying to seek. I think it's clear we would say there's a way of being that person using the parachute where they never have improper kavanah, right? They just say, oh, well, HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to make the engine of the plane cut out, and he also gave me this parachute here, and I'm going to use it, and I'll say thank you to him for saving me. And you can have the proper attitude the whole way through, but clearly there also are more complicated situations. You could start, if you make things just slightly different, where people are trying to use technology to help them decide how to act, or they're trying to use technology, they're putting their confidence in technology in ways to save them or provide them with what they need to such a degree that they feel like the only thing that matters is that they have that technology and they'll do anything to keep it, right? That really was the path that led to Paro in Mitzrayim at some level, right? Paro at some level was the master of an agricultural economy that provided people with what they needed. And so there was a path to improper devotion to the wrong power that started with just saying, well, I got to eat. And even Yosef, who was this tzaddik who was worshiping Hashem, we gather from his words, and had proper kavanah, we gather from his words, nonetheless was the sort of gateway to a whole bunch of people being slaves to Paro and worshiping him. So that's a very complicated slippery slope that we have to watch out for as well. But anyway, just zooming out from this whole initial discussion of sources, I think the main thing we want to say, to summarize, is idolatry, again using that term in English as kind of a big tent for a whole bunch of different kinds of activities. Idolatry can be something that people are doing because they want to get something that's a very definite goal they've set for themselves, and they are just desperate to purchase what they want from a power they think they can get it to them, and they're willing to engage in any activity required or sacrifice anything in order to get what they want, no matter how ritual or no matter how terrible the sacrifice, and no matter how little reason they have actually to believe, practically speaking, that this power can save them, right? So there's that. It also can be that someone who has everything they think they want is trying to decide what to do with what they have, and how to feel validated or feel like they have been virtuous, how to assign value to their activities and the activities of others. And that's another thing that engaging in idolatry can provide. And also, as well, that engaging in idolatry can span everything along the whole spectrum, from you bow down in front of a stone statue because you think that magically gives you what you want in some way you don't understand, over to you are in some philosophical framework where there are words that you're using to assign value to things that essentially, if we dig to the bottom, stand for the gods that you've decided to honor. And we can talk a bit more about what that looks like and what that means in a second. Or, also maybe you're on some slippery slope to having a problematic relationship to technology, because there are legitimate ways of living in the world and seeing practical means to accomplishing legitimate ends, and trying to use those means. But there is always the danger of becoming too devoted to those means, and suddenly you've become their slave, and really you start asking them what to value and not just what to try, not just to help you to accomplish your legitimate goal, but you very quickly give over to letting them help you decide what your goal should be as well.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.